So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our monthly Ask the Expert series. We're excited that you're here, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Gene Dantsker. Gene is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Evo Nexus, and you're going to hear a lot about Evo Nexus in just a bit. And he's been involved with this company since its founding as a selection committee member, a mentor to numerous portfolio companies, an executive in residence, and most recently, he took on the role of Chief MedTech Officer. Gene is a seasoned entrepreneur and board member, advisor, operational executive, and angel investor, and he does serve as president and COO of EvoNexus. I misspoke. Prior to this role, he worked across the spectrum of technology solutions in semiconductor, IT, medical, and biotech business. His career path is really at the intersection of engineering, science, business, and entrepreneurship. So nice, rich area for us to discover today. Gene holds BS degrees in physics and mathematics from the University of Maryland, an MA and PhD in physics from the University of California at Berkeley, and an MBA from San Diego State University, where he was class valedictorian, and he's an inventor on over 60 issued patents. So we're delighted to have Gene here. He brings a wealth of experience to the table, and we really hope you have questions for us today. So please feel free to add questions to the chat box as we go through the interview, and then I'll weave your questions into our discussion with Gene as we go along. All right, so let's get started. So Gene, please tell us your story. How did your path lead you to becoming this entrepreneur and startup wizard?
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. Really pleasure talking to everyone at this stage in your career. I'm sure there's a lot of graduate students on the line, and I was one of you. Still remember, it was like yesterday. But so let's go back to that, I guess. So, as a kid, obviously, you're a technical kid. You like technology, you like computers, you watch Star Trek, that sort of thing. You get excited about, the state of things to come. You want to also participate in it. You want to do various things and so on. That's kind of what leads you to a career in the technical arts and sciences. So I majored in physics. I went on to graduate school at UC Berkeley, where my field was condensed matter physics, or solid state physics as it's called. And the work that I was doing, I think probably was the first step to preparing me for being an entrepreneur, because the particular area or topic that I was involved in had to do with making microchips out of fairly exotic materials called superconductors. And within that space, I got a chance to do all kinds of things: cryogenics, high vacuum systems, microelectronics, physical systems, injection molding, I think, all kinds of stuff just to get my experiments built and working and so on. And of course, throughout all that time, I was working on a thesis topic, and the topic had to do with making these devices called SQUIDs, superconducting quantum interference devices, which are, when you build them right and use them right and do all the right things to them, they become the world's most sensitive detectors of magnetic fields. Now that's interesting because, it's something you're reaching deep into nature, picking out a very quantum mechanical type of phenomena that's hard to explain using any means other than sort of, quantum mechanics and things like that. And then you kind of make it do something that you want done. So in my case, I kind of got excited about using those magnetometers, as they're called, to detect the magnetic fields from the heart, from the brain, magnetocardiography, magnetoencephalography, those kinds of things. Other applications as well, such as magnetotellurics and so on and so on. But I kind of developed an interest in precisely that, finding an interesting phenomenon of nature, some corner of nature that others maybe don't quite understand. It takes a lot of work to get into it, understand it, then kind of throwing a harness on it and making it do your bidding, kind of making it do something useful. So I like that aspect of it. And I think that helped prepare you for kind of being an entrepreneur, because you're looking for, I think actually a physicist might have said something like a scientist sees what others have seen, but notices what others have not noticed, or something like that. Same thing with business people. So after grad school, I took my first job at a big aerospace company, kind of an extension of my PhD work. They had a group that was kind of doing the same sort of thing that I was, and it was an easy job to get. But then after a couple of years, I realized what I really wanted to do was something more close to what I was doing back in grad school, not necessarily just the long hours and the and the abuse and all of that, but to kind of work hard on some tough problem and develop an application out of it. And what I really wanted to do then is kind of join a startup, or create a startup company. By then I was living in Southern California, but prior to that, when I was at Berkeley, this was the Bay Area, this was the 90s. Everyone around me was creating new .coms, things like that. So I got infected by that as well. So I returned to that world, and this may be a little bit educational here. So I had some ideas, but I had absolutely no experience as an entrepreneur at that time. I had skills for sure. So what ultimately happened was I met a guy who became my co-founder, a guy named Steve. He had an idea for a startup. He had some experience as an entrepreneur, but he was missing a piece, kind of a piece of the team, the other half, and that was myself. He had experience in organic chemistry, entrepreneurship, bioengineering, things like that. I had experience in semiconductors, in making chips, that sort of thing. And together we founded a company called NanoStream, which was all around microfluidics, which is a fancy word for miniaturized plumbing. And so basically lab on a chip, you might have heard those kinds of words. Basically the whole idea, which was kind of a bit of an academic topic at the time, but also starting to make its way into the practical arts, the real world. So the idea was to, shrink a chemistry or biology lab in such a way that channels and little chambers and little mixers and so on are integrated on a small platform, and you can do chemistry and biology on liquids on a platform that can manipulate liquids on a very small scale. So it's kind of a chemistry analog of microelectronics. Microelectronics is small electronics. This is small fluidics, microfluidics. That was a neat idea, and we ran with it. And we came up with new ways of making those devices. We realized what was missing in the market. We invented a bunch of things. We invented a bunch of techniques for making them, and so on and so on. But ultimately, we decided to kind of throw a harness on it and turn it into a practical product. And we pivoted the business towards a very specific set of applications. If there are any chemists on the line, particularly analytical chemists, you might have come across an HPLC, a high pressure liquid chromatography system. And what it is, it's a machine about 2 feet by 2 feet in footprint, and it analyzes unknown compounds. So if you put a drop of Diet Coke on it, it will tell you that it's made up of saccharin, sugar, water, et cetera, et cetera. And it's used pretty ubiquitously throughout the drug discovery process, because you're always constantly finding out what is this drop of liquid made up of. So conventional equipment measures does one separation at a time, analyzes one sample at a time. We came up through microfluidics for a way to do 24 samples at a time within the same footprint and volume of a conventional system. So that was our product. Along the way, we raised some capital. We raised, we had a $1 million round where the company was about to run out of all the money, but finally we convinced some people to give us some money. Then we did a $10 million round, then we did another $11 million round, and so on. So ultimately we launched product, went commercial, grew the company to about 70 people. And it was a fantastic experience, I do have to say, because prior to that, notice all the biology and chemistry that I'm talking about. Prior to that, I had high school biology and high school chemistry. I'm an engineer, I'm a physicist. So I ran with that. At some point, I exited that company. I was the CTO of the company. I exited and joined the board of a company that was building quantum computers out of Vancouver called Evo Systems. Yeah, and that was a throwback to my PhD work in a different aspect of it, not the making of the chips, but rather understanding quantum devices and things like that. And that company, I was on the board of it for about 4 years, and helped the company out a lot with IP, with technology, with operational. Basically, they got the benefit of my prior experience from my previous company. That company actually went public a couple of months ago, 23 years after its founding. So that happens. Yeah. And I did a few other stints like that. I did a little molecular diagnostics company after that as both CEO and then eventually CTO. I consulted and served on a few boards of a bunch of startup companies, constantly, cumulatively, bringing my experience to bear. Mm-hmm. At one point, most recently, about 8-9 years ago, I joined Qualcomm, which was building a healthcare branch of Qualcomm is a semiconductor company that makes chips that go into smartphones.
Yep.
And Qualcomm decided that they need to go into healthcare now. This was around 2011. And if you kind of look at my career, I spent half of it in sort of semiconductors, physical sciences, and so on, half in medtech, life sciences, and so on. So it was a good matchup for myself, when semiconductors meets life sciences. Plus, by then I had my MBA. I'd spent a lot more time as a business person and leveraging a lot of my technical expertise as well along the way. So I kind of went from being a technical guy who does some business to a business guy who knows technical. And so I got a job at Qualcomm as a business development person, and ultimately led a portion of Qualcomm Life's business development and licensing part of the business. And I had a background in doing a lot of patents and so on, and I helped RIP portfolio, RIP management process, and things like that. And it also felt like a startup. So by the way, not every startup is a brand new startup that comes together from scratch. Qualcomm Life, when I joined, I think we were about a dozen people or so, which was kind of like a startup owned by a larger company. By the time I exited, we ended up selling the business. It ended up at Philips eventually after some sales. But by then it was about 400 people. So it was a growth curve very similar to what a startup would go through. And along the way, fortunately, my management was very supportive of me, and I got to do things like EvoNexus and volunteering for various other organizations, helping startup companies gain the benefit of my and my colleagues' experience. And I never lost sight of that, actually. I continued to be an entrepreneur no matter where I was working.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That seems to be the thread throughout your career, is that entrepreneurial component. And I'm just curious, what is it that excites you about that startup? What is it that makes you keep going back for the pain?
For the pain, yeah. It's one of those pleasurable pains, honestly. Yes. It's, first of all, it's the ability to start with a clean sheet of paper oftentimes, which is hard to do in a large organization. And from that comes the ability to pivot. So if something isn't working, that's okay, switch to something else. It's also the ability to kind of and this is not eventually you learn this other skill. If you're a technical person, you kind of start with technology and you move your way and you figure out what you're going to do with it. Once you gain some experience, you kind of learn to work backwards a little bit, or at least you work forwards and backwards. So while you get excited about the art of the possible, what can you do with what you have, you start doing the exercises of what's needed, what's required out there, and what's not being done to achieve that today. What can be done differently? Not necessarily what that I'm doing can fix that problem, but what's not being done to fix the problem that's out there. So so I think going back to it, whenever I work with entrepreneurs, and these days I work with many, there's always this opportunity to kind of say, there's a piece of the market that's being ignored, or there's a problem the absence of whose solution is maybe hurting people, or maybe hurting workflows and things like that. So what have we not thought of yet? What can we do? And then you go from there. That's a lot easier to do when you're at a brand new corporate environment than within an established one.
When the institutional boundaries are set, correct?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
So, of course, the main reason I wanted you to talk today was to share with us information about EvoNexus, your startup incubator. And I think that is a really compelling story, and it's one that I'd like to dig into just a little bit. So tell us about EvoNexus.
Sure. So EvoNexus was started about 12 years ago by CEO Rory Moore and Vice Chairman Admiral Walter Davis. It started out as a local San Diego incubator. And if you remember, about 12 years ago, we were kind of going through an economic downturn. If you were an entrepreneur back then, money suddenly became a lot harder to get. So you had to really execute in order to raise your next round of financing. And they noticed that, oftentimes, first of all, I'll tell you right now, startups fail for one reason only. They run out of money. There's a lot of reasons why they run out of money, but mainly that's when startups fail. Any company will fail because your oxygen supply runs out. But so you can add. So if you ever ask, give me a list of why startups fail, give me one reason, and then there's many reasons why that happens. But a lot of the time, the reason startups have missteps, it's usually something correctable with the right resources. There's often like, oh, I wish I knew this, or I wish this was my second or third startup, or I wish I had an advisor or a mentor or just somebody to talk to who says, no, son, just do this. And it makes a big difference because 9 out of 10 startups, I believe, don't see their 5th birthday. And oftentimes it's correctable, not for every case, but for those that are correctable, it ought to be corrected. So a startup incubator kind of serves that function. And what they wanted to do was to create a startup incubator where promising startups can come in, can settle into a facility free of charge. So basically have free room and board, not do it for 6 weeks of a boot camp type of thing, but rather just be there for up to 2 years.
Wow.
While they're not under the burden of having to pay rent and given a little bit of a reprieve from a couple of those missteps. So one way to avoid those missteps is to take out the burden of paying rent and utilities and things like that. The other one is to give them access to the right kind of mentorship. Now, no two people, no matter how brilliant, can provide all that mentorship. So what EvoNexus created, and this is how I got involved, EvoNexus kind of spread itself out and started bringing in mentor volunteers, people who have experience and people who have a little bit of time on their hands and who are willing to help out a handful of startups, maybe 1, maybe 5, whatever time they have. Mm-hmm. And the volunteers, which we now have about 80 of, they serve the function of, first of all, helping us bring companies into EvoNexus. So when a company applies into our incubator program, we put together a committee of experts, business experts, technical experts, market experts, whatever expertise is pertinent to this particular applicant. And we take them through a pretty tough application process, which is 3 steps. And leading to a due diligence, kind of a deeper due diligence process, very similar to what a VC would do, a venture capitalist would do. But at the end of the day, a venture capitalist decides whether or not to write them a check, whereas we decide whether or not to admit them into the incubator, which means we're deciding whether or not this company, if admitted into EvoNexus, would be on the right kind of trajectory, such that with our help, they can get the check written in the next 6 to 18 months. Mm-hmm. And that's, we're kind of putting our reputation on the line because we're going to find out in 6 to 18 months whether we were right or wrong. Mm-hmm. So the numbers kind of speak for themselves. So when we created this incubator, and like I said, I was a volunteer for many years, but I was a very active volunteer. I helped a lot of companies along the way. So in the last 12 years, EvoNexus has incubated about 260 startups out of about 4,000 applicants. So we're free, but we're selective. That's okay. About 85% of the startups that we admitted have raised capital, which is a very good number to hit. The amount of capital they raised in total, that 85%, is about $1.6 billion to date. So they raised some good capital. In addition to that, out of those 260 admitted companies, about 40 had exited. In other words, were acquired by someone. Total exit value now is in excess of $2.1 billion. So if we were a venture fund picking companies, we have that in common with them, would be a very good venture fund because we've had a good track record of picking those companies. And what makes it somewhat interesting, unique, fun for all concerned, including volunteers and mentors and so on, is that it's all about alignment. A startup wants to create alignment between their vision and the vision of some eventual acquirer or some market that if they go public, for example. They want to align that vision with their entire team. They want to kind of all roll in the same direction. They want to have the right kind of help when that help is called for. So for example, when we admit a company, in the early days, the help they might need might be purely on the technical side. Somebody who's done this sort of product device before might be able to help them, or building a team or filing their first patent. Later on, the help might be more in the organizational or in the operational side of things. Certainly at all times, they need help in raising capital, and that's something we'll also help them with. So whatever help is needed, EvoNexus provides them. We're a nonprofit incubator. I don't know if I mentioned that. So we do this pretty much as a nonprofit. And the currency of our success is not the return on our investment, so to speak, but in the building of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, which benefits everybody. And that's why we have sponsors, big companies like Qualcomm and Verizon, Dexcom, ResMed, and many others who continually sponsor us by writing us checks because they want to see sort of an upswell of promising startups that would eventually solve the problems that those big companies are also facing today.
So you may have answered the question that just came in the chat. So the question is very interesting. Claire wants to know, where does EvoNexus get their funding? So you've mentioned that big companies giving checks, but there's a lot of money floating around with all of this, right?
Yes. Yeah, Claire, good question. So I'll tell you, we used to get it from one source. Now we get it from two sources. So the one source has always been sponsors. When we started the incubator, the value prop, everyone got a value proposition, whether you're a profit or a nonprofit type of business. So the value proposition to our sponsors are that we're going to build up the entrepreneurial ecosystem that is going to provide the kind of disruptive innovation that you will eventually, that you frankly need to solve anyway. And if you read books like The Innovator's Dilemma, for example, you find out that big companies are really good at what's called sustaining innovation. It makes fiscal sense for them to pursue it. But when it comes to completely disruptive innovation, I can give you a few examples later, big companies are not really set up. It doesn't make fiscal sense to go to invest in such high risk ventures. Otherwise, it just doesn't work out. So, but startups are all set up for disruptive innovation. So, first of all, we say, sponsors, you always want to have a big pipeline of startups eventually to acquire, because you might not want to acquire them today, but in a few years, if they're fully de-risked some kind of a problem that they set out to solve, and certain Darwinian forces have maybe, thinned the herd, you might end up with a few companies that are really interesting for you. And whether you want to acquire them, sell to them, buy from them, partner with them, and so on, they've been kind of clarified. They've been purified of sorts to work in a way that's to work towards the things that you want them to do. So that's one source of our operating capital, which is, existing companies simply sponsor us and write us checks on an annual basis. We also started a few years ago, taking a small amount of equity in our companies, a very tiny amount compared to other incubators. We take 1% equity in common stock, which will be diluted. So it's tiny, but we basically realized that it's a nice way to offset our capital requirements. And given our track record, it's not a bad source of capital as well. I'll let you know how it actually works out, because I think we're only about now getting our first couple of returns, but that's the other source of money for us. And the third source is almost everyone who provides sort of this manpower, this work for EvoNexus, does so as a volunteer. So sometimes a good source of money is lack of a cost.
I like that a lot, and that really does make sense. And why do you think these people volunteer? Why did you start volunteering?
Yeah, it's an addictive thing for me, at least. When I was working at Qualcomm, I actually represented Qualcomm on EvoNexus selection committee. Mm-hmm. And actually, I really enjoyed my job at Qualcomm. It was very, very, very interesting, very diverse, and all kinds of wonderful things were happening. But I did not get to work on a startup at that point in my career, and I like that. It's a niche that you want to scratch once in a while. So the opportunity, I actually have no trouble getting volunteers to this day, because there's always people who are saying, "Oh, I need a few hours a month to work on something else." It's a hobby, you can call it that. It's a very self-fulfilling type of experience. That's one aspect. The other one, a lot of people just want to give back. Yeah. I've had a good successful career. I want to help. I'm looking at a couple of smart 20-somethings. I can really help them. Yeah. So guys, come to my office, we'll talk. That happens a lot with our volunteers. Yeah.
Oh, and I like that too, because that ability to have somebody you can just ask what you think are dumb questions, mm-hmm. but they aren't, I think is so powerful. I really like that.
We also look at that as kind of some of the questions are very easy to answer. Some just require an extra pair of brains on it. So sometimes we say we're like the sixth man on your basketball team. If you're going through a tough process, you're trying to figure something out, strategically speaking, you bring me or one of our volunteers, they'll join the process. Together, we'll work something out. That happens a lot, actually. As a volunteer, I did a lot of that.
Yeah, that's really, really amazing. So we have some folks on the line who might be thinking about a startup, who might be thinking about an incubator program. So, what's the first thing they should think about if you wanted to get engaged, and how do you even know which incubator program is right for you?
Yeah, I would say first have a startup I put together. Obviously you apply to an incubator as a company, not as a person. Mm-hmm. So maybe just take a step back. If you're thinking about starting a company, which I highly encourage, oftentimes think in terms of, what are you trying to ultimately achieve? Is there a fit between your wants and desires and the environment of a startup that you can be trying to put together? Do you have the right team? Do you have a team? Is anything missing? Once you realize that a few things are missing that's probably the right time to start thinking about mentorship, and that's probably the right time to start thinking about incubator, because an incubator can provide a lot of that missing pieces of that. And if you have an incubator like EvoNexus, we can provide a lot of the missing pieces, not just one, and for free for that matter. So that's always a good thing. You also want to think about in terms of, do you have, whatever you're working on, is it an idea, a project, a device, or a business? And I intentionally made it in that progression because they all kind of go through that progression. But ultimately, when you raise capital, when you create an entity that takes somebody's external investment and creates a return for them, only a business can really do that. Some kind of a business that sells product or services, generates returns, and so on. So definitely think in terms of how you're going to leverage your idea into a business that generates revenue, the oxygen of a company. And what's interesting, I found that, two extremes. Oftentimes people with a technical bent start a business and they're really good at coming up with something disruptive and something really, really advanced, but they don't think as hard about the business model sometimes. Similarly, very business-minded people think very deeply about markets and business models and so on, but they sometimes gloss over the technical side of things, sort of, draw a box and say something will happen over here, and I'm exaggerating a little bit. Usually it's a combination of two. And by the way, everyone glosses over scale-up, manufacturing, and market penetration. There's never enough of those. So think in terms of that. And as you're building a business, and then when you see what's missing, an incubator will become a very apparent solution to you.
Interesting. So when someone says, Gene, I'd really like to talk to you, I've got this thing. What questions do you have when an entrepreneur first approaches you?
Yeah. So first of all, I always say yes, by the way. So I'm encouraging anybody, just reach out to me. So there are sort of three key questions that are always good to ask yourself, or others will ask you for you if you're starting a business, starting a company. And they are, who's your customer? How big is your market? And why you? There's also a zeroth question there, and that's, what's your technology and does it work? If it's technology, obviously it has to work, but this is, we're assuming that you've got that part, you think you've got that part figured out. So those are kind of the usual sort of entrepreneurial questions that are kind of whose answer is kind of an elevator pitch. If you're familiar, basically something you say, we've identified the following business opportunity, we're building the following solution, and here's how we're going to go about, penetrating the market with it. That's the kind of, I usually ask questions that elicit that little paragraph narrative of an elevator pitch. And if a person can't quite come up with a 4-sentence, 5-sentence type of explanation of what their business is in a comprehensive way, that's what they really need to work on. And my questions will elicit that very quickly.
Yeah. So what was one of your most fascinating stories that you heard, or what, do you have somebody that kind of stands out to you that you could share a little bit about that particular company?
Yeah, I got a few. So since I'm talking to university people, I would say probably a quarter or maybe more of our startups were founded by people who recently left the academia, left the university, PhD students, postdocs, that sort of thing. Give you a few examples. So some success stories. We have a company that's gone through EvoNexus called BioLink, for example, came out of a nanoengineering electrochemistry lab. The founders wanted to build an on-skin patch that measures a variety of bioanalytes non-invasively or minimally invasively. They were brand new entrepreneurs. The joke is that they never started a company before. They never had a job before because they were, students at a university, and that's not a job, that's an adventure. So, they started the company, and they came into EvoNexus, and they pivoted early on from doing a variety of analytes that they wanted to do to ones that the market really wanted, namely glucose, blood glucose, which is a big holy grail out there.
Yep.
And to date, they raised, so they went through EvoNexus, spent 2 years, building up their minimal viable product MVP, coming up with all kinds of ways, and eventually solving the tough problems of how do you penetrate the skin at the right place, how do you do the analytics at low power, how do you manufacture those, how do you manufacture it at all, how do you manufacture it at a reasonable cost in a way that the market can sustain, how do you deal with all the other market forces like competitive forces. They're not the first ones to try to measure blood glucose or all kinds of other ways of doing it. How is this going to be any better? Why should we buy from you? That sort of thing. The long and short of it right now, that company is in a big building here in San Diego. They've raised about $120 million to date.
Wow.
And so that's a successful company. Give you one that came out, another example I like to name. There was a founder came out of Illumina, which is a big, next generation sequencing company. He was in charge of advanced bioanalytics projects. Every big company has some advanced version of what they're doing to kind of look at the next generation or the generation after that. In this particular case, Illumina, he was just moving beyond the horizon that Illumina was willing to entertain. So he was again a PhD guy. He was thinking that we should just go full throttle, do something complete way out there. And so he left Illumina, started his company, came through EvoNexus. What was interesting about that company, two things, I guess. One is that some of Illumina's original founders ended up investing in this company because they know a good thing when they see it. And the other one is that the company was purchased last year by Pacific Biosciences for $800 million. That's one of our success stories. So, in all cases, everyone kind of took a chance. And one thing, maybe going back to your question, when you're thinking about starting a startup, I would say a question to kind of ask yourself is decide whether there's something you want to pursue, full barrel, or do you have other priorities in life? Do you? One question I like to ask sometimes people is, do you care more about fame, fortune, experience, or do you just want to get going? You don't want to think too hard about any of that. So some people I know just want to get going. I was probably myself. If I was asked back then with my first company, what do you want to get out of it? I was like, I just want to get going.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So what attracts you to a startup team? What makes you think, okay, here's some potential?
Yeah, so we like to see passion, professionalism, a certain degree of maturity. Coachability is really important. I mean, for an incubator to accept you, we have to be able to help you. And by coachability, I don't mean imposition. I mean coachability. Are you willing to work with others, whether they're always going to be in your team? Do you have a great deal of confidence with a dash of humility, as well as a desire to learn and keep learning? Because you know what, you don't know what you don't know, and the more you know, the more you know. So a lot of startups, my own included, have pivoted many times, and you have to be able to recognize opportunities for those pivots. So was it Louis Pasteur who said, "Opportunity favors a prepared mind"? Something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
So prepare yourself, but also look for those opportunities to leverage that preparation. As far as like what makes them what you can make yourself more attractive to somebody, to an incubator or to an advisor or to an investor even, is obviously do your homework, understand your market, understand the business environment you're about to go into in terms of what are the competitive dynamics, what's the history of it, if it's a medical type of thing, maybe medical device, what's the regulatory environment like? Have devices similar to yours gotten regulatory approval, at a cost that you can bear? And generally speaking, just be a hustler. Be willing to come up with things as they need to be come up with.
It was really interesting. We had someone we spoke to not too many months ago. And one of the things that she brought out was the problem has been there forever.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, blood glucose has been a problem forever, right?
Yep.
So how are people handling it today, and what's the value proposition that your device or solution is going to provide? And I love that thinking of like, no, you didn't invent this problem. This problem's been here for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's the solution side that matters. And I found that I see that sometimes people think they've discovered a new problem, but the reality is it's been handled. Even if that means death, it's been handled in some way, right? Yeah. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to flip it around a bit.
And I can even tell you, like, for example, take something like blood glucose. I know entrepreneurs who say, you know what, blood glucose monitoring is useless. I'm going to come up with a way to grow insulin cells in the pancreas.
Right.
So there's all kinds of ways of approaching in this case, a market problem, but it's also like a very important health problem, things like that. So I'm always very enamored by, watching entrepreneurs come up with completely, left field type of, solutions that no one else has even considered, way outside of the scope of the conventional approaches.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we have another question from Claire. I love your questions, Claire. So she said, you mentioned most of your academic innovators are students or postdocs. Do you see fewer founders who are university faculty? Can you comment on the likelihood of company success when the academic founders are established faculty versus students or postdocs? So a couple questions in there.
Absolutely. So there's some similarity. So let's look at two groups, faculty and recently graduated or recently exited students and postdocs. Obviously, there's a lot of similarities between them. They have very similar educations. They have, they have similar credentials. They see the world kind of, in an analogous way. On the big difference is faculty probably want to remain faculty, whereas those students and postdocs are willing to do the startup full-time, beyond full-time. And startups, whether an academic co-founder is involved in one or not, which is fine, by the way, I've seen lots of startups and I've had startups with academic co-founders for sure. A startup needs a full-time team. So whether that full-time team is recently graduated people or people that have been brought in, a startup is not a part-time endeavor. So those are kind of the big differences there. So founders of startups, I've certainly seen them be, people who still have other jobs, faculty jobs, research jobs on the side and so on, provided their institutions are letting them do that. But when it comes to raising capital, when it comes to growing a company, it really needs a full-time management team. And the faculty people, I've seen them do one of two things: either stay on with the company as some kind of a perpetual advisor, somebody helps them out, maybe a source of technology, a source of intellectual property, a source of science and data, a collaborator frequently. Or I've seen a few cases when faculty people have quit and started a company. One such person started Qualcomm, as a matter of fact. That's, Irvin Jacobs and Andrew Viterbi, actually, not Qualcomm, the predecessor to Qualcomm. They were both faculty professors at UC San Diego, and they left those jobs in order to start the first company. And they were good faculty. They were textbooks, or that whole thing. So that happens. So yeah, I think sort of an inception or an idea for a startup certainly can and often does come from academic sources. It now comes down to who's going to operationally execute on it.
Mhm. And have you seen any differences between students or postdocs versus established faculty in terms of success?
No, not really. At least I haven't. Again, I think when it comes to the founders, it's nice to see inceptions from founders, but it really comes down who's actually running the company. And you tend to forget about the origins after a while. It's so, like I said, mostly if it's students, postdocs, ex-students, ex-postdocs running the company, by then their academic roots are far in their past, my own included, this example. So, and the company succeeds or fails on the basis of the execution. If a faculty person was involved early on or still is involved as a collaborator, as an advisor, maybe even as a part-time CTO of sorts, I've seen it work both ways. It's certainly not a hindrance for sure. It often is a big help.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I just want to make sure that when you're talking about starting a company by faculty versus starting a company by a student, we're still talking about the inception. We're not talking about the success, which has a lot more to do with operation than inception.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, so I teach the I-Corps program
Mm-hmm.
here
Yeah.
for CTSI, and we see a lot of people come in, and it's so much about the idea. And it's not until after they go out and do some discovery that they begin to understand that their value proposition has to be tweaked and that they do have a customer, and it may not be who they thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that to be really fascinating. Before I have another topic I wanted to address with you today, but I have one more question. When someone graduates from EvoNexus, what do they look like? What's in place in your mind when you say, fly away?
Yeah. In fact, whenever a company matriculates, I should say, whenever it's, it joins EvoNexus initially, when we have their onboarding, their orientation, I usually, if I'm involved with them, I usually say, congratulations, you get in. Now my number one goal is to get you out of here. I want you to outgrow us. I want you to need more space than we can provide for you. So by the time they graduate, a typical graduated company will have raised their Series A rounds. Sometimes they've raised their Series B rounds. They have at least an MVP. Definitely, oftentimes they have a product. Oftentimes they have sales by then. They've got their team more or less in place, the kind of the core team, and if it's commercial, then some origin of their sales team and things like that. And they have the ability to, it comes down, they have the ability to pay their own rent. So when they graduate, they usually, rent out space elsewhere. They move in there and they're firing all cylinders. So we've graduated, in the last handful of companies that have graduated, I would say typical, maybe they raised about $10 million by then, something like that, the last few that I've seen do it. And that's a good amount of money to give you a couple of years of runway, depending on what you're doing, to actually go ahead and succeed or fail, but with the resources that you now finally have. Right. You did not have those resources when you came into EvoNexus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really interesting because it sounds like they're perhaps a little bit further along than you might expect.
Sometimes there's a little further along. You mean when they graduate?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, by providing this up to 2-year program here, we're kind of, I don't know, maybe call it, over ensuring success.
Fair enough.
There are programs out there that, for example, will give you a boot camp for like 8 weeks and then have you fly away, or sometimes they'll charge you rent or something like that, and then you can stay as long as you want. We tend, we tend to attract companies just by the nature of the type of incubator that we have. We tend to attract companies that are doing something hard. So, and it often does take the entire 2 years to, let's say, if you're a chip company, you need to do a few tape outs. That's expensive and it's time consuming. If you're a medical device company, you got to get it through clearance or approval, depending on what route you're taking. And that can also take time and money and so on. So, giving them that runway, kind of 2 years, first of all, gives them that opportunity to get going and succeed without that burden of running low on capital, but also oftentimes it gives them the opportunity to hyperextend their success. So you don't have to stay for 2 years. You may have been able to graduate after 1 year, but because you built up so much momentum, oftentimes we do graduate companies that are at Series B, and sometimes they actually don't have time to move out because they're so busy. So we have to help them. So kind of giving them a big launch pad. Oftentimes, if done right, it can be very advantageous. They can really launch and fly, and that's what we like to see, and that's kind of what we look for when we admit them first. Are they accelerating? Can we really put more fuel in a tank and really get them going?
That's wonderful. So speaking of money, is venture capital a good idea?
Sometimes it's the only idea, but I'll tell you, let's just talk for a second. Why do companies need capital? Right? Unless you've got a product that you're selling from day one, you can get revenue that way. Usually, you have a lot of costs before you become profitable. So before you go into venture capital, it actually is worth thinking a little bit about where else can you get capital. So, for example, there's customer-funded capital, NRE. In fact, I don't want to mistake myself, but I know one of the big companies I've worked for got the original capital that way. So if your customer is really excited about what you're doing, they're willing to prepay for NRE. That's an option, right? You can take on debt. But most likely you're going to raise venture capital. And most likely you're going to do a first round that's probably not going to come from a venture capital firm. It's probably going to come from a handful of angel investors. Your first million or so will probably come from individuals who have the money, but they believe in you, and they're enamored by what you're doing, and they have been convinced by you that this is a legitimate, sufficiently low risk venture for them to put their money in, as opposed to putting it into someplace else or keeping it.
Yeah, interesting.
But if you need to, eventually, let's say if you're a medical device company of some sort, if you just look at the history, a typical medical device company needs to raise something like $30 to $45 million just to get their product through some kind of FDA clearance. That's not my opinion. That's just stating data, yes. Right? So that money has to come from somewhere. And the only real source of capital like that are venture capital firms, and they're set up to evaluate, analyze, and eventually invest in companies like that.
Interesting. So we have another audience question. Do the sponsoring companies of EvoNexus have any strings attached to their contributions? Do they dictate the types of tech you support, or require that they get first access to acquiring successful companies?
So there's no formal strings attached, but what I love about the fact that we have about 30 or 35 sponsors, they're a very diverse group of companies, but more importantly, they're the kinds of companies that our startups eventually want to become, or they're the kinds of companies that deal with the types of general problems that our startups want to ultimately solve. So the word that I often use is alignment. So what we provide is for a startup company and for an established company to align strategically some of their goals. And we do that the analogy often used is like big companies are aircraft carriers. They have a lot of fuel in the tank. They're big. They're never going to run out, but they move slowly and they're moving in a very particular direction. Whereas startups are speedboats. Limited fuel in the tank, can pivot in any direction, but they're trying to meet the aircraft carrier at a particular location further out, somewhere further out in time. What we provide is kind of radio communication between the two of them. And I've had my own moments when you meet with a big company and you've got a startup and you build a bunch of things and you do all this, and then the big company says, "Boy, if we only met you 2 years ago, we would have told you to do X instead of Y." And you go, "I wish we had met you 2 years ago because it didn't matter to us whether we're doing X or Y. We would have done what you ultimately have desires for us to do." So this alignment between an established company and a startup company is part of the value to both of those stakeholders. So no, there's no official strings attached, but the value that we provide, if there were strings attached, this would be the string.
Yeah. So there's no rule that they can have first access or anything like that?
No, officially no, but they often do, just by virtue of them being involved and aligned and so on. So it just happens that way anyway.
Well, and it seems like that would be a very nice strategy to get these companies involved if their interests are being addressed in some way. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what attracts them. That's what attracts the big companies. They see our portfolio of companies, they get access to them. I mean, others can get access to them as well, but by being sponsors, of course, they get special access. They get routine access, and that's actually what attracts them to us. They also get access because we're in San Diego. Quite a few of our sponsors are not in our region, but they wouldn't get access to our region because it's a very hot region right now.
Wonderful. So let's talk a little bit more about you, Gene. So you've kind of talked about what really, your passion led you into doing startups. So I always love to ask this question because I think it's a very good question. What was the smartest move you made with your initial startup when you were learning how to be a startup and all those things back in the day? What was the smartest move you ever made?
I don't think there was any one move in particular that I can pin that definition to, but I would say there were probably a lot of them. And I thought thinking a little bit about it. I think they all had to do with the team, with having the right team around you, whether you're hiring somebody or bringing someone on as an advisor or finding a partner in the first place. It's always remarkable to discover what you can do with a group of people who think a little bit differently from you. So having the right team together is probably kind of comprehensively the best set of moves I've had with all of my companies, frankly, with all of my jobs.
So what was the thing you did that you really would do differently today? Was there anything out there that you would do completely differently?
Well, it may sound like a commercial, but I really do wish I had an EvoNexus in those early days, because I think we learned a lot of things the hard way that we could have learned, in an hour. So I think having the right kind of mentorship and the right kind of experts and access to those experts, so you can just pick up the phone or the equivalent today and get advice. It's remarkable how well you can do with the right resource and a 15-minute conversation to just propel you along. I wish I had more access to something like that in those days.
Yeah, I think that sounds absolutely spot on. So for those of us that are interested in launching a startup or engaging in an incubator, what kind of advice would you have for this?
So first of all, think about what is it that you want to launch a business around. Presumably you have at least an idea. You have an idea, a product, a device, and so on. Going back to an earlier question, I think, try to think through how that idea translates into a business. And have fun with that, right? Because when you're at that stage, you can pretty much do anything. I mean, you're not locked into anything at all. So if you have a particular device or a particular piece of code or a particular market opportunity, ask yourself what's missing in this. You don't have to get into a formal business plan. I remember when I had my first idea back in grad school, I bought a couple of books on how to write a business plan, started putting something together, got lost, but it certainly doesn't hurt to think through the various aspects. I mean, you can look at those things online, or I can send you a list. I mean, what are the key ingredients of a business pitch? What's your secret sauce? What's your unfair advantage? How big is your market? Do you even know how to figure out how big your market is? Well, they're not here to learn something. You could look that up. I mean, these days it's so easy compared to 20 years ago to just find things out. You've got the internet at your fingertips. Right. There's no textbook to go. You don't have to go to a textbook and learn things from chapter 1. You can actually, an evening of Googling gets you really far along. So like I said, be inquisitive and be thoughtful in terms of how is it that your idea, which probably has a few vaguenesses associated with it, how is it going to translate into a realistic business? A business school professor of mine once said, turning your assumptions into knowledge. You probably start out with a lot of assumptions and go ahead and identify them. Here's what I think. Okay, well, let's get from here's what I think to here's what I know, or here's what I seriously know, barring a few things that I might not know, that sort of thing. So think through that. Also think, I go back to the thing of a team. Are you going to do this by yourself? Are you going to team up with one or more people? Are they the right people? Is anyone missing? Embarking on a journey like that with the right group is very important. And you also want to make sure that everyone's kind of thinking along the same lines. You're all in agreement about what you're trying to attain. You all get along, things like that. So between kind of fleshing out your idea into a business and having the right troop to do this with, you're well on your way.
Yeah, I think that it's amazing when we work with early stage entrepreneurs. It's hard when you don't know what you don't know, and trying to get that piece all wrapped around it so that you can really have this clarity, I think, is key. And I'm curious also, when you admit someone to EvoNexus, what is that first few weeks like? What are the first things you focus on from EvoNexus perspective?
Yeah, great question. So like I said, we're not a one-size-fits-all incubator. By the time we admit them, the admission takes place as a result of a vote that takes place during a due diligence process. By the time a company goes through the third step in the application, it's a sit down to our due diligence, and we bring in all kinds of experts from our pool of volunteers. And we take, the company pitches and we ask a bunch of questions, and we dive into their IP or their financial statements or a cap table, whatever it is. And then when we choose the company, we talk about them and ultimately take a vote. And then we decide, hey, who on this committee is willing to step up and be a mentor to those companies? Usually a few hands go up, and usually we'll have a team, maybe 3 people, something like 3-4 people. So when a company is then told the good news and they move in, and we kind of show them where the coffee is and everything, we sit down with them and their team of mentors and say, okay, let's talk about you. Let's talk about your company. Never mind our process, never mind the correct way of doing things. We really are a very dedicated, very drilled down type of set of resources. And we have the people that can do it. We have, oftentimes somebody on the mentorship team in a pinch can step in and be the CEO of that company if they need to. So we get very, very deep and very visceral with the company. And the company usually at this point spills things like, oh, we're really having a hard time figuring out how to manufacture this one piece, or we need to find a CRO for some piece of technology. They all say we need capital right away.
Yeah.
And we try to figure out, well, how much capital do you need right now? How much you'll need a year for? We kind of help for this. So it's a very targeted, very very dedicated type of process. Those first few weeks kind of set them up, and oftentimes they've never had this much mentorship in one go. And again, we kind of their team is doubled briefly, and from then on. They have a lot to work with, a lot to think about, and then we do this again and we do this again. We do this at least on a monthly basis, and oftentimes, if we do it right, then they stay in touch with us because I'm in the building all the time and they talk to me and all of that. So that's what the first few weeks are like. Basically, kind of getting more fuel poured into their tank and kind of get going from there.
That's awesome. So, how many companies are going right now at EvoNexus?
At any given time, I think about 15 to 20, something like that. We have various companies who have like 1 foot in and 1 foot out. COVID was interesting. During COVID, we brought in a few companies kind of in a virtual way because our companies themselves became virtual. But now we're back in person, and we actually moved into a new location. We have more space now, so we're actually actively admitting more companies. We can handle more than we have during COVID. So actually, if anyone knows of any good companies they want to apply, let me know. I'm very happy to even have an informal discussion with them.
Awesome. Gene, I cannot thank you enough. This was really fun for me, and I learned a lot. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure our group to here did as well. So thank you very, very much. And we will sign off and let everyone get back to the desk. All right.
Thank you very much. Have a great week. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye, people.